Just 24 hours ago, United States President Donald Trump stood before cameras in Florida and delivered a definitive message to the global public. He declared the military campaign against Iran, quote, pretty much over. The administration projected total victory, asserting that the Iranian military apparatus had been effectively neutralized and calling for an unconditional surrender. Global financial markets reacted immediately. Crude oil prices, which had previously spiked to near $120 a barrel, reversed course, dropping 5% to sit just below $90. The market priced in peace. But the reality on the ground and in the skies over the Middle East presented a sharply contrasting picture. Within hours of the president's declaration, regional defense systems tracked a massive coordinated launch from Iranian territory. According to regional military commands, 15 ballistic missiles and over 100 unmanned aerial vehicles were fired, not at United States military installations, but at civilian and energy infrastructure in the United Arab Emirates, alongside a strike that hit near a United States diplomatic facility in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. The Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps issued a statement through state media shortly after the launches. They categorically rejected the United States' demand for unconditional surrender. Furthermore, their command structure issued a direct counter-narrative, stating that Washington does not dictate the timeline of the conflict and that Tehran alone will decide when the war concludes. To punctuate this stance, Iranian officials reiterated their threat to completely blockade the Strait of Hormuz. This narrow waterway is the transit point for roughly 20% of the world's daily oil consumption. This presents a critical geopolitical paradox. Why would a nation currently facing overwhelming aerial bombardment and the systematic dismantling of its military infrastructure reject a ceasefire? Why is Washington rushing to declare a victory that Tehran refuses to acknowledge? And most importantly, what happens when a localized conflict metastasizes into a regional war of attrition that holds the global energy supply hostage? To understand the mechanics of this standoff, we must analyze the data and military movements from the past 48 hours. The United States and Israeli joint initiative, widely reported under the designation Operation Epic Fury, has been unprecedented in its scale and intensity. According to Pentagon briefings and satellite imagery analysis, coalition forces have struck over 400 distinct targets within Iranian borders. The primary objective of these strikes has been the systematic degradation of Iran's conventional military capabilities and its economic lifeblood. Sorties have successfully hit 5 major oil storage reserves in the Tehran and Alborz provinces. However, the most consequential strike occurred when dozens of fighter jets reportedly penetrated deep into Iranian airspace to target heavily fortified subterranean command centers. Multiple international news agencies, citing regional intelligence sources, reported the destruction of a bunker complex, resulting in the death of Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. While official state confirmation regarding the exact circumstances remains tightly controlled, the immediate elevation of Mojtaba Khamenei to the highest echelon of leadership signals a rapid and forced transition of power during a state of total war. From the perspective of the White House, these operational successes translate to mission accomplished. The president's address emphasized that Iran is now operating with no functioning navy, severely degraded air defenses, and shattered internal communications. The logic follows a traditional military doctrine: apply overwhelming force, decapitate the leadership structure, destroy the logistical capacity to fight, and the adversary will capitulate. Yet, the diplomatic channels reflect a completely different reality. Reports from European diplomatic sources indicate that an Italian intermediary delegation attempted to deliver a ceasefire framework to Tehran. The proposal was built on the premise of halting the airstrikes in exchange for Iran laying down its arms. Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi publicly dismissed the overture. The Iranian Foreign Ministry's official position, echoed by the newly consolidated leadership, is that accepting an unconditional surrender under the current conditions is not a path to peace, but a formal acceptance of regime collapse. This brings us to the expanding scope of the conflict. This is no longer a bilateral engagement between Washington and Tehran. The geographical footprint of the war has widened dramatically in a matter of days. Airspace over Turkey, Iraq, and Lebanon has seen continuous violations in transit by military aircraft and projectiles. More critically, the conflict has violently dragged in the Gulf states. The United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, nations that have spent the last several years trying to pivot their economies away from regional conflicts and towards global investment, now find themselves on the front lines. The The strikes on Abu Dhabi and Riyadh demonstrate Iran's strategic pivot. By targeting the wealthy, relatively less heavily defended neighbors who host United States military bases, Tehran is applying indirect pressure on Washington. The message is clear. If Iranian infrastructure burns, the economic hubs of the Middle East will burn with it. We are currently witnessing two entirely different strategic objectives colliding in real time. The United States administration requires a rapid, decisive victory. An extended military engagement poses severe logistical challenges, risks dragging the United States into another prolonged Middle Eastern nation-building exercise, and presents significant domestic political risks as the country prepares for an upcoming election cycle. The economic imperative is equally strong. The global economy cannot sustain a prolonged oil shock, and the administration needs to project stability to the markets. Conversely, the objective of the Iranian leadership, particularly the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, has simplified to a single imperative: institutional survival. They operate under a doctrine that views unconditional surrender as an existential threat. If they capitulate now, they lose all leverage, signal weakness to their domestic population, and face potential internal fragmentation. Therefore, their strategy relies heavily on asymmetric warfare. They recognize they cannot win a conventional air war against the United States Air Force. Instead, they are leveraging their remaining assets, ballistic missiles, drone swarms, and proxy networks to inflict unacceptable economic and political pain on United States allies. This creates a dangerous divergence between public statements and military reality. While the political leadership in the United States signals the end of operations, the United States Central Command continues to issue operational updates, detailing ongoing sorties intended to hunt down mobile missile launchers and secure the region. This indicates that military planners recognize the threat remains active, even as the political narrative shifts toward closure. The most alarming signal emerging from this data is the shifting of red lines. For decades, the unwritten rule of Middle Eastern conflicts has been to avoid total disruption of the energy markets. However, the Iranian threat to close the Strait of Hormuz is transitioning from rhetorical bluster to a tactical necessity from their perspective. By refusing the ceasefire, Iran is essentially telling the international community that they are prepared to utilize their ultimate economic weapon. The calculation is that the United States and Europe will eventually back down to prevent a global recession, rather than fight a grinding war of attrition to completely dismantle the Iranian state. This standoff fundamentally changes the nature of the conflict. It is no longer just about military dominance. It is a test of economic endurance. The question is no longer whether the United States can destroy Iranian military assets. They clearly can. The question is whether the United States and its allies can absorb the collateral damage that Iran is willing to inflict on the global economic system in response. To comprehend why Tehran would actively choose to prolong a devastating aerial bombardment, one must examine the strategic doctrine of the current Iranian leadership. Defense analysts point to a concept often referred to as the white peace trap. From the perspective of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, accepting an unconditional surrender after enduring massive strikes establishes a fatal precedent. Their internal calculation dictates that if they capitulate to secure a halt to the bombing, they signal to Washington that military force can be applied without long-term consequences. This sentiment was explicitly articulated by Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi in a recent broadcast on state television. He stated that during previous diplomatic engagements, Iran accepted pauses in hostilities only to face renewed pressure and sanctions once they had conceded leverage. The official stance is that an unconditional surrender today guarantees regime collapse tomorrow. Therefore, the strategic choice is not between peace and war, but between a slow political death and a high-stakes military gamble. This gamble relies heavily on exposing the structural constraints facing the United States administration. While the United States military possesses unparalleled aerial and naval superiority, military strategists note that the executive branch operates under severe logistical and political limitations. The president has not secured a formal authorization for use of military force from Congress for a prolonged, multi-year conflict or a ground invasion. The Pentagon's current posture is designed for rapid, punitive strikes, not a sustained occupation of a mountainous nation of nearly 90 million people. Furthermore, the domestic political clock in Washington is ticking, with an upcoming election cycle, an extended war of attrition that spikes domestic gasoline prices and risks American casualties becomes a massive political liability. Iranian strategists are acutely aware of this timeline. They operate on the assumption that while Washington controls the airspace, Tehran controls the clock. This dynamic reveals a critical blind spot in the initial strategic assessments of the campaign. A prevalent assumption was that a decapitation strike, specifically the elimination of the supreme leader, would paralyze the Iranian state apparatus. History and military doctrine often suggest that removing the apex of a centralized command structure leads to rapid collapse. However, intelligence assessments of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps reveal a highly decentralized, asymmetric command network. By removing the central political authority of the Ayatollah, the strikes may have inadvertently eliminated the primary restraining force within the Iranian government. Regional security experts suggest that the localized commanders of the Revolutionary Guard are now operating with unprecedented autonomy. Without a supreme leader prioritizing diplomatic survival, these commanders are executing pre-planned retaliatory protocols based purely on military instinct and a mandate for retribution. A military force that no longer relies on a central node for permission is inherently more unpredictable and difficult to negotiate with. The immediate human and infrastructural toll of this miscalculation is mounting rapidly. Within Iranian borders, independent observers and state agencies report civilian casualties exceeding 1,300 alongside catastrophic damage to civilian infrastructure, power grids, and water treatment facilities. The cost of a rapid victory strategy is visibly devastating on the ground. Conversely, the conflict is exacting a direct toll on United States personnel and strategic posture. The Department of Defense has confirmed the deaths of 7 United States service members in the region due to retaliatory strikes. In response to the escalating threat level, the State Department has issued urgent evacuation orders, attempting to move tens of thousands of American citizens, contractors, and non-essential diplomatic staff out of the Middle East. This mass exodus contradicts the official narrative of a stabilized, post-conflict environment. This brings the narrative versus reality dynamic into sharp focus. The official communication from Washington projects a scenario of peace achieved through overwhelming strength. The messaging suggests the adversary is broken and incapable of sustained resistance. Yet, the reality on the battlefield, characterized by continuous drone deployments, ballistic missile launches, and shifting front lines, reflects a classic war of attrition. Iranian military spokespersons claim they possess enough subterranean munitions and decentralized launch sites to sustain offensive operations for 6 consecutive months. This protracted reality is sending shockwaves through the regional geopolitical architecture, particularly among the nations involved in the Abraham Accords. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates find themselves in an incredibly precarious position. They are long-standing economic and security partners of the United States, hosting critical American air bases and naval facilities. However, their geographic proximity to Iran makes them immediate targets for short-range ballistic missiles and drone swarms. The recent strikes on Abu Dhabi and Riyadh were not random. They were calculated messages to the Gulf monarchies. Iran is effectively pressuring these nations to restrict United States access to their airspace and military bases. The Gulf states are caught between a historical reliance on American security guarantees and the immediate physical reality of Iranian warheads landing on their oil refineries and financial centers. They are being forced to absorb the collateral damage of a war they did not initiate. This regional panic accelerates toward the ultimate economic scenario, the blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. For decades, threatening to close the strait has been a standard element of Iranian geopolitical rhetoric. However, military analysts warn that the current conditions transform this from rhetoric into a highly probable tactical maneuver. Closing the strait does not require Iran to achieve naval superiority. It requires only the deployment of naval mines, coordinated attacks using fast attack craft, and the continuous targeting of commercial oil tankers with coastal anti-ship missiles. Even a temporary disruption or the mere establishment of an uninsurable risk zone for commercial shipping would immediately halt the transit of millions of barrels of oil per day. The resulting supply shock would ripple through the global economy within days, impacting everything from industrial manufacturing in Europe to domestic fuel prices in the United States, potentially triggering a severe global economic contraction. The core question for the international community is no longer about the extent of damage the United States can inflict on Iran. The focus has shifted to whether the global economic infrastructure can withstand the retaliatory measures Iran is willing to deploy. If the economic shock of closing the Strait of Hormuz represents one potential future scenario, military strategists are simultaneously modeling a second, equally complex trajectory, the limit of air power, and the potential necessity of a ground offensive. The current United States administration has historically campaigned on a platform of military restraint and the avoidance of protracted foreign engagements. The strategic design of Operation Epic Fury was predicated on achieving objectives exclusively from the air and the sea. However, military history demonstrates that aerial bombardment alone rarely forces the capitulation of a deeply entrenched adversary. As the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps continues to launch mobile ballistic missiles from subterranean silos and deploy drone swarms from decentralized, hidden locations, the Pentagon faces a severe tactical dilemma. If the administration cannot secure the airspace of its regional allies, and if the threat to global shipping lanes materializes, the effectiveness of the air campaign diminishes. At that juncture, the military command must present the executive branch with a binary choice: accept a strategic retreat or deploy conventional ground forces to physically secure launch sites and coastal batteries. Implementing a boots-on-the-ground strategy is the exact scenario Washington intended to avoid, requiring massive logistical mobilization and drastically increasing the probability of prolonged casualties. Yet, there is an even more critical signal emerging from the data, representing the ultimate retention of leverage by Tehran. Analysts monitoring weapons proliferation warn of a chilling, unintended consequence of the current campaign. For years, international intelligence agencies and nuclear watchdogs have tracked Iran's uranium enrichment capabilities. The primary deterrent preventing Tehran from weaponizing that material has been the threat of international isolation and targeted military strikes. By initiating a massive bombing campaign and demanding unconditional surrender, the United States may be inadvertently altering the nuclear calculus within Iran. If the conventional military infrastructure is systematically dismantled, and if the state faces an existential threat of collapse, the strategic logic for restraint evaporates. Defense analysts argue that by pushing the regime into a corner where survival is paramount, the campaign may silence internal opposition to nuclear weaponization. The most profound paradox of this conflict is that a military operation designed to neutralize a regional threat could serve as the catalyst that rapidly accelerates the creation of a nuclear-armed state. To synthesize the developments of the past 48 hours, the outright rejection of the end-of-war declaration by Iranian leadership is not an act of mere defiance. It is a calculated doctrine of survival. The conventional air defense arrays of the Iranian military may be heavily damaged, but their geopolitical weaponry remains fully operational. This conflict illuminates a defining characteristic of 21st century warfare. Overwhelming conventional air superiority and technological dominance cannot guarantee capitulation if the opposing force possesses both the capability and the willingness to drag the global economic system into the conflict. You can control the airspace, but you cannot dictate surrender to an adversary prepared to leverage mutually assured economic destruction. Based on the current trajectory, 3 key takeaways define the immediate future. First, a fundamental misalignment of timelines exists. The United States administration requires a rapid, decisive resolution to project strength and stabilize domestic markets, while Tehran's survival depends on pulling coalition forces into a grinding war of attrition. Second, regional allies, specifically the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia, are absorbing the retaliatory impact, transforming into unintended geographic buffers and complicating the United States security architecture in the Middle East. Third, the Strait of Hormuz remains the ultimate arbiter of this crisis. Its operational status over the coming days will determine whether this remains a contained regional conflict or triggers a severe global economic contraction. The central question remains: who will blink first in this high-stakes geopolitical standoff? Will the administration commit to a prolonged, escalating engagement to force a surrender, or will the looming threat of the greatest oil shock in modern history force a diplomatic compromise? Leave your assessment in the comments below. Thank you for watching, and remember to subscribe for continued, data-driven analysis of global events.